Mr. Foster for 3 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I'd like to thank the gentleman from Maryland for coordinating this discussion and thank the ranking member for yielding. Madam Speaker, a Supreme Court sitting with only 8 justices, including the Chief Justice, is not good for democracy. The failure by the Senate to consider our president's nominee because of the electoral cycle is an abdication of constitutional responsibility that is without precedent and without reason. Now, I am best known to my colleagues as the last PhD scientist in Congress, or perhaps as the businessman who founded a company with his brother that now manufactures most of the theater lighting equipment in the United States. What is less well known is that I am also the son of a civil rights lawyer who wrote much of the enforcement language behind the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Like me, my father was a scientist, and he stepped away from his career in science to become a civil rights lawyer. There was a decade between the Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education that held that racially segregated school systems were inherently unequal and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. My father spent most of that decade traveling around the South, advising school boards and federal judges on the nuts and bolts of school desegregation. Then, in August of 1969, President Richard Nixon nominated Judge Clement F. Haynesworth to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. The nomination was to replace Justice Abe Fortas, a liberal from the New Deal era, and the confirmation of Clement Haynesworth would have shifted the balance of the court significantly to the right. Many liberal Democrats were strongly opposed to the nomination on ideological grounds. But my father knew Judge Haynesworth from his years working in civil rights. He knew him to be an intelligent and a fair-minded man. And so my father was called to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee in support of the nomination of Clement Haynesworth. My father's testimony cited specific cases in which he, my father, as an avowedly liberal Democrat, would have decided otherwise. But he pointed out that the decisions could be sustained by a reasonable man and could be sustained under precedent. In the closing of my father's testimony, he said, "The question for me is not whether I would have made another nominee for the Supreme Court. It is rather the question of whether Judge Haynesworth possesses the qualities required to become a fine justice of the Supreme Court." This is the standard that should be employed by the Senate today. The President alone has the authority and the obligation to nominate a person to serve on the Supreme Court. The Senate can defeat that nomination through a vote on the Senate floor after hearings and thoughtful considerations of a person's judicial temperament and intellect. I believe that considering those characteristics makes it clear that Judge Merrick Garland is eminently qualified to sit on the Supreme Court. But from the framers to my father to today, we have established frameworks for making those decisions. The Supreme Court should not be, as a famous president once said, a political football, and filling the bench is vitally important. So I urge my colleagues in the Senate to give Merrick Garland what liberal Democrats gave Clement Haynesworth: hearings and a vote. In 1969, finally, the Senate voted to withhold its consent for the appointment of Clement Haynesworth 3 months after his nomination. 38 Democrats and 17 Republicans voted against it. I think that the process will make it clear how qualified Merrick Garland is and that he will be confirmed. But the Senate must follow the process established in the Constitution for reviewing a nominee. Thank you, and I yield back.